One of the most asked questions I get on this channel is how to start a podcast on YouTube, which is so crazy that people are thinking about it. And today I've got an expert to help you do exactly that. Heather Havenwood, an award-winning media mogul known as the Chief Sexy Boss, author of the top-selling book, Sexy Boss, and the host of the podcast, Heather Havenwood Uncaged. She is regarded as a top authority on podcast marketing, and she's going to help you answer your questions on how to start a podcast, generally speaking, and especially for people that have YouTube channels. All that and more coming up on the VI show right now. That's right. Welcome to Video Influencers, where we're helping build your influence, income, impact with online videos. Sean and I started this channel to interview people who are crushing it on this platform. So subscribe for more interviews just like this. And we're the co-authors of YouTube Secrets, the ultimate guide to growing your following and making money as a video influencer. Get a copy at Audible, at Amazon. I suggest the audiobook because we just updated it. And once it's finished, you'll get the free update on the audiobook. Anyways, we are going to be talking podcasts today. Believe it or not, a lot of people are still thinking about starting podcasts, but especially wondering, how do I apply my YouTube channel to it? Do I start a YouTube channel? Do I put the whole thing up? We're going to be answering all those questions. So without further ado, Heather, I would love to introduce you to the audience. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Awesome. Appreciate that. Can you see me on live on vMix? I can't see you guys.
You know, I can hear you, but I cannot see you right now.
I'm in.
Oh, there you go. So, well, Heather, thank you so much for being on the show. I'm excited to talk all things podcast, but how it relates to YouTube. But before we do that, first off, you've been on a lot of podcasts and you've uploaded a lot of podcasts. Can you tell the audience a little bit about your experience? Because I know that you're a businesswoman first. You've built multiple very successful ventures. You've done all kinds of things all across all social media, including Clubhouse. You have a huge following there. But podcasting is kind of like a special niche of yours. Tell us about your experience there. And then also, let's dive into what podcasting in 2021 is like.
Yeah, it's a great story, actually. I mean, at the end of the day, I always tell people I'm not a podcaster, I'm a marketer first. And that kind of throws people because a lot of podcasters aren't marketers. And I started my first online business in 2001. I made my first million online in 2005, but then I had my first bankruptcy in business in 2007 and 8. And I built 4 businesses, $1 million after that. I have a supplement company, a weight loss company. But here's what happened and why I got into podcasting. I actually got into podcasting because I had a supplement company back in 2015 that we launched. We had $0 for ad spend. We tried to do a Facebook ad and we kept getting denied. And so I thought to myself, well, what if I got on podcasts and I started just sharing my personal story as a woman and then basically dropping the link about our supplement company because the target market was women. And the first year I was on 150 podcasts.
Wow.
Now, that's really important because I had launched a podcast in 2013 and it like miserably failed. So when I started in 2015, I was like, I'm just going to focus on being a guest. And basically, here's what I did, Benji. They interviewed me, right? But in the green room, I interviewed 150 podcasters. What's working? What's not working? What are they doing? What's all the questions? Then in 2016, I launched my show, went from 0 to 29 different radio stations across the country, right? And millions of listeners in the first 6 months. And then now I've been interviewed over 450 times. So I basically interviewed other podcasters by being on their show. And that's why I think now I'm just so ahead of the game on what's working, not working in this particular medium. So that's kind of what happened. From that, though, I built a coaching business around it, and now I coach and consult people on how to build their own shows.
That's awesome. I need your consulting. And funny enough, you talk about the green room. The name of my podcast is called The Influencer Green Room because it's the same concept, right? People want to hear from the influencers, from the creators, from the business people, successful people like yourself, Heather. So make sure you guys go check it out. I think the link is down below in the description. You can find it on all the podcast platforms. But yeah, no, that's awesome. And I love how you talk about it's important to have your own show, but it's just as important to be on other people's show. I think that's probably the number one question people have. And I remember one of my lessons in real estate is it's not about owning the real estate, it's about controlling the real estate. And I love how you made that, kind of like judo flip, even though it was somebody else's show, you were still like delivering your message, providing value. So I think that's my first question. 2021 podcasting, where is it and how do you get onto other people's show or get people onto your show?
So let's start with basics since you understand influence marketing. I believe that right now we're in the new world of what I call sonic brand influence, that our influence is by our voice. You have to own your voice. Your voice is your influence. So now I didn't brand that. That's a really Gary V. He coined that back in about 2020. I read an article from him and I thought that's interesting. Right. So you and I, right, this is the first time I've actually seen each other, but we spent time together and we've connected on Clubhouse, which is voice only. Right. So we as human beings don't have to actually see somebody to be able to connect with somebody. And Absolutely. I think that's really interesting because what's influence? Influence is the ability to move people from where they're at to where another location could be like, click, buy, purchase. That's just influence. So you don't even have to have video to create that is my point.
Yes.
Right. And I think that audio, especially with Clubhouse and Green Room, no pun intended, Green Room and more happening is that we as human beings want to connect more than ever. And it's an engagement of voice more than ever. So that's why I think, let's just start there.
Yes.
And that's why I think right now, and its statistics show that podcasting is not only not going away, it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Nothing against you YouTubers. Okay?
Yeah, no, well, let's talk about that real quick because, of course, I've been a YouTuber first for over a decade. So I always had this idea, and hence why I wrote YouTube Secrets. It was originally supposed to be called Video Influencers because I just thought video would dominate. But I find myself more and more these days having the podcast on because I can listen to it while I'm running errands, while I'm, in the garden, while I'm doing some chores at the house. I do a lot of dishwashing at home. But you can't do that with videos. In fact, it's like stressful. You're always pausing the video because you don't want to miss that like scene or whatever. And why Clubhouse is so important and why it blew up. That's where you and I met. I completely agree. You can get so much value out of a conversation. It's literally the oldest like skill humans have, just talking to each other. And that's why I'm geeking about podcasts, but then the question is, how do you apply it to YouTube? How does that come back? But yeah, let's keep diving in. And
I want to go down one more point that why I think Clubhouse is so popular and podcasting is too, is that we as a human race, I think we're tired of what I call push marketing. Yes. So influence, like Instagram is a push marketing, Facebook's a push marketing, Twitter's a push marketing, right? Even YouTube has some push marketing, let's just say. Podcasting, I always have it that podcasting, I always have the vision that you and I are just having a conversation and other people just get to listen in like we're having coffee. It's a very more casual. It's not a forced. There isn't a third element called the audience. Like in Hollywood, there's a third element, always an audience. So it's a showcase. In podcasting, it has that cash. It's that cash and people want that because at the end of the day, people want to be connected to people. Right. And we as human beings haven't changed that much since biblical times. Right. The technology obviously has changed, but we just want to connect and people want to have that engagement versus the push. They can listen, but that's not necessarily a push. And I think that's why it's grown more and more. And as you said, you can be anywhere and listen to an audio, right? You can be running, you can be doing the dishes, you could be, for me, it's been unpacking. So I've been in Clubhouse pretty much for hours, but I've been unpacking, right? I've been doing stuff around the house. So I think that's the power of it. But more importantly than any of that, like, end of the day, it's about sonic brand influence that you want people to go, oh, that's Benji. I hear his voice. And I have that with you. Whenever you're in a room, I don't even have to look at the image. I know you're in the room when you talk. It's like I've now connected your voice with you. I don't even have to like look down to see you're in the room, right? Yeah. That's power of influence on audio more than anything.
For sure. And by the way, thank you so much. Same thing with you. And I think that you can build a brand with just your voice. And I think the powerful thing about podcasts for a creator is you don't need a lot of gear. In fact, one of the most successful podcasters I know uses his phone. And he gets millions of downloads every single month. I was suggesting some gear. I was like, hey, you know, you can plug something in to your iPhone and it's going to like level up your voice 10x. He obviously doesn't need it. Point being, anybody can start. But, you know, today's discussion is about video podcasts, hence YouTube. So what do people need to know about podcasting 2021? Like some of like the basic tips. And then, of course, one of the big parts of podcasting is getting on guests or being on other people's show. What's your advice for people just getting started this year?
So when I say podcast, I always think video as well, because why would I ever not do an interview video as well? Because it's a repurposing tactic. So even though I say podcasting, right, I always think video as well. One is like engagement. I can see you, feel you, connect with you. But also it's a repurposing conversation, right, completely. And I love you YouTubers, but there's just so much more networks. So here's what I tell people around this, right? We can take this video, extract the MP3, right? And then make sure that it's on networks around the world. Now, let's just do an example. If I took my computer, got on a plane and flew to India and sat in India, right? And opened up my computer and went to YouTube, it would look completely different based on basic Google knows where I'm at, right? Well, I could take my audio. So it's really hard to market to those people. Let's just say, you know, India, Asia, whatever. But if I take my audio, I can literally almost like fly to India or Asia and put it in the largest networks in the world. So Savannah, which is one of the largest India networks in the world, has 230 million listeners just in that network alone. And just to give you context, the rest of the people, you know, America only has 330 million people totality. Okay. So 230 million people on one network, and they love Americans. Are they buyers? Are they followers? Are they listeners? Absolutely. But you're missing out on that when you're just uploading from America into America YouTube, because it's not going to go to other places as much. Right. So it's harder. It's more challenging. So my point to that is, I think that where we're at, I always teach how to do a podcast on video, how to do setups, studios, basics. But I'm always saying, let's extract the audio as if no one's watching, so that you can get the highest exposure across the world. That's kind of what I teach. Totally. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, and I completely agree. I think, why not? If you've got the equipment and you're comfortable on camera, record the video version. Now, one thing I've learned quickly about doing podcasts that's different than doing like a video podcast is kind of performing to the camera, right? I mean, like, it's just so normal for me to look at the lens. That's one reason I think I'm having fun with Clubhouse, because I don't have to worry about something looking at me. And, you know, I think this goes for anybody, but especially women. Like, sometimes you feel like you got to get all done up, right? Or you got to make sure the lighting's right or whatever. Any advice for people who are recording a video podcast but knows that's going to go to an audio only platform? You know where I'm going with this? Because there's sometimes a disconnect. You can't have visuals and you can't rely on those when, you know, the podcast goes out onto like a podcast platform.
Right. Well, a couple things is you have to think like you're on radio, that no one can see you. So if I said, oh, you look nice today, right, Benji, I'd be like, I love your red shirt today, Benji. It looks amazing. That would be something you'd really think about. The other thing is when you start describing things, you got to make sure you speak in a way where people can literally visualize it, right, without actually seeing it. So those are different things I look at. Of course, I always talk about the lighting and I always talk about the video, because you need to learn those skills. But what I find interesting is a lot of people, if I could just help people start the audio podcast, then they gain the confidence to go into video more, right? Yes. But what's interesting, let's look at video podcasts for just a second, right? So Joe Rogan, Howard Stern. Okay, let's look at them for just a second. So obviously you can watch Howard Stern or you can listen to Howard Stern, and vice versa on Joe. Okay. Now, one thing they both do, and I watch Hollywood, right? I watch them because they're brilliant. What Howard Stern does, there's always a third element for him. Same thing with Joe. and our old friend Rush Limbaugh, who's no longer on the planet, is that they always had what I call a producer that came in. So Howard has his girl, who's escaping me for the second. Oh, is it Rebecca? Oh my God. Totally.
I know who you're talking about. I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
With Rush Limbaugh, he never had a person. He called him Mr. Snardly. And he would talk to him like, Mr. Snardly, what? Yeah. Like, do that. And then Joe Rogan has his sidekick. He doesn't bring him in as much, but there's still a third element. So if you really want to get into what I call show making video with podcasts, you got to create that third element. If you're just doing interviews, right, it's fine, but it doesn't have that third element piece, right? You can create that though. You can create that.
For sure.
So look at Ellen, look at Jimmy Kimmel, any Tonight Show, they always have the third element. The third element is them, the interviewee, you know, the star, and then the third element is either the audience or the band. So they talk to the band. So if you really look at Hollywood and the power of what they've created, a show that can be audio and visual, that's how they do it. That's like next level, but not everyone does that.
I love that you talked about, even if you don't have a host. I have a host here, Nuchile. I don't know if he wants to chime in, but having something, you know, to bounce off of is really important. Even if you don't have those, just having a character or using the audience to have that discussion, you can do it completely on your own. And so I think that was a point I was trying to, you know, pull out, which is, when you're creating a video podcast, keep in mind, if you are truly wanting to be successful at podcasts, don't rely on visuals. Like Heather mentioned, you know, you have to describe it. And that's why I feel like video creators going to podcasts isn't as obvious a step as going from a podcast to the video. You know, yes, there's a learning curve for adding all the visual elements, but you already know how to communicate in a way that speaks to both. And this is what's interesting. I'd say my one big takeaway, and then I want to move into kind of like best practices and niching down and your messaging. But what makes those other podcasts you mentioned so successful, they're not worried about the camera at all. They're just having a pure, like, uninterrupted discussion with the person that's in their studio. Even when they are chatting with nobody, they're talking to the audience directly, but they're not worried about the visuals. Anything you want to mention there?
Howard Stern never looks at the camera. Joe Rogan rarely looks at the camera. A really good interviewer Oprah never looked at the camera. Okay, I grew up with Barbara Walters and Oprah, right? They never looked at the camera, but they always talked to their audience, right? There's a distinction with that. I kind of watch Hollywood and like how they do really great shows. Barbara Walters, Oprah, Ellen, not so much, Jimmy Kimmel. The only time Jimmy Kimmel looks at the camera is in his monologue, right? He looks at the camera and he talks to camera. So it's challenging because we as human beings want to be like, the camera, you know what I mean? But it's not really, I'm not really talking to the camera right now. I'm talking to who's listening, like how can I add value to them? It's not about me. And I will say this in the most loving way. A lot of speakers, because I come from the speaking world, suck at interviews. Like they just suck at it. And the reason that is, and it's not, you know, it's in their training because they're taught to speak at people, not with people.
Right. Yeah. And
that's the difference.
They're used to having an audience that they can kind of see, that they can kind of bounce off of versus video. You got a camera, right? Or in this case, we got a screen and a camera. Amazing advice. And by the way, if you guys are just listening into this, we're interviewing Heather Havenwood. She is a podcast marketing expert and so many other things. Now, real quick, mention one of the reasons you're on the show today is you've got an event that's going on. We're talking about podcasting and how it applies to YouTube or vice versa. Tell us about that event, and then we'll move on to some of the final points before we get into Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's the thing. I believe, this is my belief, that every single person on the planet can create a business from nothing, as long as they have pretty much two things, a podcast, right, and an offer. And I really believe that. If they can create their own show to get leads, right, and to convert leads, they can build a business anywhere. I really believe that. So I believe that everyone should start with a podcast to understand how to create their message, how to listen to other people's messages, how to interview, and how to be interviewed. I truly like freaking believe that on the core. Why? Because I started my coaching business literally from my podcast. I had no website, and I just shared my message, shared my knowledge, and I started my coaching business. That's it. That's all I did. So I'm doing a 3-day event. It's a very exclusive event, 3-day event, and it's a workshop. It's a done with you workshop. At the end of 3 days, you'll have your show, your name, your image, your description, and have it up on 22 networks around the world, not just the United States. It's in 3 days. So if you DM me, if you go to my Instagram, because I like to have a conversation. I'm all about like, talk to me, right? So go to my Instagram. It's Heather Havenwood. Follow me. That way your messages go to spam. Follow me. DM me the word podcast, one word. And then that kind of raises your hand to me so I can have a conversation. But it's 3 days. You can also go to podcastersclass.com. But thank you for that. And I truly believe that in all of my heart, that every person should have a podcast to really support them in their business.
Well, that's exciting to literally have almost no equipment, start a podcast, and start making money. You know, one of the things we believe here at Video Influencers, we wrote this in YouTube Secrets, we're not coy about making a living from what you're doing. In fact, that's what funds the dream. And so I believe the same thing can happen on YouTube, but we're talking on podcasts. Let's bring it back now to kind of the general practices and principles when it comes to branding, right? So here on YouTube, it's so important to have a niche, to have a focus. When you're starting out and you don't have an audience, you're not known yet. On podcasts, because so many of them are conversations, does that same principle apply? How is it a little bit different? What's your advice for somebody that's starting a podcast when they're thinking about their branding and messaging?
So it's interesting you said that. So when I first got started to podcasting, pretty much the only podcasters out there were digital marketing agencies. And the reason that is they would have like a marketing podcast, you know,
Yeah.
And then what they would, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So they have a marketing podcast. And then what they would do, think about this, they would then go out and interview their potential clients. So they'd reach out to me and go, hey, we'd love to have you on the show and share your story, which I did. And then in the green room, they basically go, oh, by the way, this is our services. Do you need that? So the reason I say that, and it worked because I hired some of them, but the reason I say that is because I think that podcasting is what I call top of the line funnel. It's a top of the line funnel that if used correctly in business development, it could attract your target market, attract the people that they want to know about and learn about, but it also can move people down the funnel, right? So even though I talk about podcasting, my show isn't called podcasting. It's just Uncaged, and I want to talk about all entrepreneurs, right? So it's a little more broad. It's a little more broad in the world of podcasting. That's what I recommend and what I tell my clients. Now, if you want to go, if you're, let's say I have a friend who's a sex coach, so she focuses on females specifically, and her podcast is just more about female and the feminine vibe, right? And she brings on other people that are not in her niche, but it attracts her potential target market. So that's how I see podcasting as a business tool, which at the end of the day, I'm a marketer first, and then a podcaster and a creator second.
Yeah, and that's completely different from YouTube, at least from the advice we generally give people, especially beginners.
Right.
You want to go super focused because it's so based off of search. The difference with podcasts, though, so much is based off of your personality. Those two things are completely different, and so this is why I asked this, and this is where people can get lost. And in fact, even my strategy, my podcast is called The Influencer Green Room, similar, very broad, but we definitely talk more about YouTube because we're thinking about searchability. So that's my last question before we get into the mistakes people make. How do you get found, right? How do you get discovered as a podcaster?
Okay, so a couple ways. Number one is definitely being a guest on other people's shows. Some people ask me, how do I grow my podcast? I'm like, well, one, are you on other people's shows and are you promoting them? So in my first year that I was on 150 shows, the reason I got on so many is one, I pitched myself. Like I cold call pitched myself. But number two is I promoted the hell out of them. So whenever I was on someone's show and I promoted you as well, I'm very big on promoting other people's shows. And that got me on more shows because people liked that I promote their show, right? That's a big one. How many times have you had a guest on and they don't promote anything? You're like,
yeah.
dude, come on. Where's the juice, dude? Right? It's a big one. At the end of the day, you're sharing your audience with me. And so that's important. And so I want to share my audience with you. So that's a big, big one. And people know who are givers and who are takers. The next thing is repurposing. Because you have the video, it's all about repurposing. I use some softwares that I take and really repurpose into audiograms across multiple platforms. That's the next big, big one. A lot of people don't take that to the next level. In fact, I prove in the model that I've done one podcast a week, that's 52 weeks. If you repurpose it correctly, you can have between 8,000 to 10,000 pieces of content at the end of 1 year.
Wow.
And yeah, across multiple platforms, pulling people into your groups, databases, and pages. So those are the two big ways that I talk about.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think that networking is huge when it comes to podcasts. In fact, I find the podcasting world, because of Clubhouse, much easier to network and get people on your shows and be on other people's shows, just because that is part of it. Like, we have a whole chapter in here about collaborating on YouTube secrets. And we talk about how it's literally the best way to grow next to going viral, which you can't really control. I mean, some people say there's a framework to it, but collaborating, you can actually create that connection and collaborate. And so with podcasting, I think it's huge. In fact, I believe I'm going to be on your show. I don't want to invite myself, but you mentioned it. And so again, like you're doubling your exposure. And so I think that a lot of creators, regardless of the size of the audience, it's more like the relevance of the audience. So know that there is a community of connection with podcasters. Now, really quick, is there anything you want to add or, say in addition to that? Because I have Sean Cannell, who's ready to ask one of the first questions. So go ahead.
Okay, so super quick. So one of the things, because I'm a club pod leader into Clubhouse, and I get the same question all the time, a lot of from speakers. Yeah. And they say, well, I just want to be a guest on podcasts. And I'm like, it's not going to happen. I mean, you can get a few, but it's about give and receive, right? So majority of the time, if people have me on their show, it's 9 times out of 10, I'm going to recip. If they just want to be on my show and they don't have a show, unless like they're just like a Todd Herman who I just interviewed, like he's amazing, I'm a no. Yeah. Like, why? You're going to take from my audience, but then I can't receive. There's no take and receive. So I think that's a really important part. And you know this, it's hard to connect with another person on YouTube when they don't understand what it takes to be a YouTuber. Right. Right. So same thing with podcasts. It's like, you gotta be one of us. And once you're a podcaster, you're one of us, you know what it takes. And then I feel like it's a better recip. And by the way, when I say this, I will be on anyone's podcast that has one person listening. I don't care. I'm not about, it has to be the numbers. And I love big numbers. Your show is amazing. But I just want to share people. It's not necessarily about the numbers. It's about that exchange. Yes. It's just about the collaboration exchange. That's what it's really about in the serving.
It's interesting because in YouTube, so I'm going to get Sean up here in a second, but in YouTube, it's a given. If you don't have a YouTube channel, how are you supposed to collaborate? Even if you don't do anything on their channel, the assumption is, hey, if you collaborate on mine, I'm going to be able to help you get more subscribers or build your audience, right? That's not always required that you do on both. But if you don't even have a YouTube channel, then what's the point? Now, if you're just a homie or a friend or whatever, but that's what's interesting in podcasting, I just would think that's obvious. So first up for questions, raise your hands on Clubhouse. We've got the Sean Cannell, who is listening to you, Heather, and has a question for you about podcasting. Sean, welcome, obviously, to Video Influencers. We started this channel together. What is your question for Heather when it comes to podcasting and how it relates to YouTube?
Yeah, hey, what's up, Benji? And what's up, Heather? Really great advice. Really appreciate you. And I have 2 questions. The first question is, you're a show expert, so what are some elements for spicing up a show? I was really loving that third person element. That was an unlock. And I think about shows like John Lee Dumas, has a lightning round. And when we were hitting the road, Benji and I, doing a lot of interviews, that's kind of where we got inspired to do a lightning round. So if you thought about like segments And what are some of the elements to spice up a good show?
Yeah, and I'll just reiterate the question for the audience. Thank you so much, Sean. He asked, especially with audio only, how do you spice it up? For example, he loved that third person element because that automatically spices it up. You're adding a whole nother character you can bounce off of, even if it's a made up person or the audience. So what are some other pieces of advice to spice up an audio only piece of content?
Okay, so a couple things. One, the third element, just going a little bit deeper in that, the person doesn't have to be there. I've seen a few people talk about their wife as the third element, like, oh, my wife yesterday, like, what, honey? Like, you can add whatever you want. Like with Rush Limbaugh, he talked about Mr. Snardley. He would just stop and say, Mr. Snardley. There's one. There's definitely a lot of ones where people say, well, I ask these 3 questions at the end of every show. I like that too. It's okay. It's not like, oh, that's super sexy. I personally like what I call diving into the conversation. And there's what I literally say this in front of you. You'll get this too, Benji. I say this at the very front of my podcast every single time. I go, look, 1, it's my show. I may interrupt you. I tell people that. Number 2, I know you have a book or product and that's super cool and we'll talk about it. But this is about, I want to go deeper on you and your personal story. And then we're always going to promote your book or show or whatever you want to promote. I'm a big person on that. Those are the kinds of things I focus on. And I do like John Lee Dubas and how he does is very structured. I know that from a female perspective, I like his show. I'm not very drawn to his show. His show is very structured and mechanical, and that's not something I enjoy listening to. And I love John Lee Dubas. I respect him, but doesn't mean I like his show. And then the other one is just really allowing the conversation to breathe, right? Allowing the conversation to breathe and be willing to disagree. Yeah. Like, I know that sounds crazy, but be willing to go, oh, I like that, but I don't really agree with you on that one. Like, it's okay to have a disagreement. That's one thing a lot of podcast hosts don't do is they're afraid to say, like, I like you and I don't agree with that. Why do you do that? Let's go further into that. They're like unwilling to create entertainment. At the end of the day, it's infotainment and you have to be willing to have some fun with it. So that's what I would say.
Awesome. And I know Sean has one more thing he wants to ask. Sean, any thoughts, any replies to her thing? And what's your next question?
Yeah, I love it. Great insights. The final question I have is, I'm sure a lot of people can relate to feeling that it's 2021 and maybe feeling like there's competition in any niche, but especially in, say, like marketing, social media, things like that, entrepreneurship. What would be your advice when there's a lot of different options on, say, entrepreneurship for creating a show that's different and stands out?
I love that. Well, I would say the same thing for YouTube, right? There's so much competition, but you can't win the game if you're not playing the game. And here's the good thing is that statistics show the last statistic I saw from 2019 to 2020, the consumption rate in North America alone has gone up 20% in podcasting. Now that could have been of what happened in 2020. We're home a lot more. Who knows? It's about 57 million adults. And so here's what I think. People are leaning into consuming from experts and influencers more than ever. They're learning that they want to understand what's really going on in the marketplace. They don't trust the media anymore. They don't trust that. And so they're looking for other places to learn and entertain. So now's the time more than ever to start only a video. I mean, for me, a YouTube channel, I'm diving in. I'm creating my entire living room into a because of Benji was like, don't do a living room, just create a YouTube studio. I'm like, okay. So I'm in the middle of doing that. I think with anything, marketing's fierce and marketing's competitive. But if you focus on your message and focus on how you can serve the client and serve the listener, I think that's all that was. It's really attraction marketing at the end of the day. Yeah. Right. It's really a collaborative. And I'll leave with this. I'm a football fan. I'm a Cowboy fan. I'm a Texas girl. And I believe that business is a team sport. I just believe that. And if you go in trying to just be number one without playing team, I think you'll get slaughtered. If you go in from a perspective of adding value to the marketplace, because you're paid for your value in the marketplace, adding value to your co-collaborators and other influencers and creators and connect, I think you're going to be really successful, period. And that's on any platform, from Instagram to TikTok to YouTube or podcasts. If you have that mindset, you will succeed, period.
Yeah, I love what you said because it shows a huge distinction from podcasts to YouTube. For example, YouTube, we suggest to somebody that's starting out, focus on a niche and understand what your value proposition is, right? Be very specific because that's searchable. That can rank when people are looking for something on YouTube. With podcasting, what you just mentioned is focus on what's your unique brand and your unique message, because that's what's going to stand out. Because like you said, like just like on Clubhouse or just podcasts in general, you're connecting with this person. And one thing that I find that is different about audio only or podcasts, the personality is even more important because usually there's not a visual. Would you say that's accurate, the distinction I just made, and how that's one of the big differences? And this is why, like, it's not obvious going from YouTube to podcast or podcast to YouTube.
Yeah, here's the thing I would say. So 55% of the listeners of Howard Stern hate him.
Oh.
Now think about that for a minute. They hate him, okay? I'm going to make a point with this. There's another person, I'll say one word, and no matter who you like, know, or trust, or what side you're on, you will have a reaction to this word. Trump. Mm-hmm. You'll have a reaction. Whatever that reaction is, fine. But that, to me, love or hate, is influence. The moment someone has an emotion around someone else's emotion or some other person, that's influence. That's a response. So in the world of, we all know Howard Stern's voice. Someone could be playing right now, even Trump's voice. Like him or not, you know his voice. And so with that said, around video to audio, you don't need to have the video to have influence, but you have to be willing to dive into having a stand on something, right? And having a stance on something. In fact, one of my coaches, Roberto Blake, he coached me for a little bit on YouTube. He said, one of the challenges you have right now in your content, this is 2 years ago, is you're not taking a stand on anything, Heather. And so I started taking a stance on something. But with podcasting, you can go broad, and then inside episodes, you can go more niche because it's not SEO'd. The SEO is only the title. And people aren't going to Spotify and iTunes and saying, how do I cook dinner? Or how do I start a business online? That's not what they're not using as a search engine. So it is very different. And people want to feel like, okay, I can listen to Heather. I know that she's going to bring in badass people. I know her story. I connect with her. I get her and I trust her. And so I'm going to listen to her show. And even if they don't like me, I think that most people like me, but if they don't like me and they trust me, they'll subscribe, which is very different, I think, than YouTube. But I could be wrong, but that's just my take.
Yeah, no, I love it. And I would not focus that heavily on the stance on YouTube just because, again, it's harder for somebody just getting started out to do that. But with audio, it's actually easier. So thank you so much. And thank you so much, Sean, for being on. Obviously, I'm grateful to have you here. And we're going to be doing Q&A a little bit more, but there's just 2 questions I want to bring up before we get to that part. So if you're getting value out of this, hit that like button. Make sure you subscribe to Video Influencers for more interviews just like this with people like Heather who are just crushing it when it comes to podcasts. We're talking about how it relates to YouTube and vice versa. One of my questions kind of relates to what Sean was saying when deciding, like how to make your show a little bit better, that third party element, deciding your niche or your kind of like targeting. My question goes back to a video I saw of yours, which was really entertained. I'm not going to mention the influencers you were calling out, but you were saying, hey, I hear some of these experts, these so-called experts, and they talk a great talk, but I know that they're not living in reality. They're coming from a place where they're basically just actors in front of a camera, and you said, hey, if you're an entrepreneur, you're busy. You got things to do. You got to run your business. You've got to manage employees. You got to make money. So like this ain't this thing where like you have a nice, I mean, ironic because you're setting up your YouTube studio, right? But, you know, it's a juggle. So that's my question for you, kind of wrapping all this up is, what's your advice for somebody like a YouTuber who's already super busy creating content, maybe even doing on social media, to add in a podcast into the world? You kind of went into about, you know, being video centric, starting there, and then like scaling. Any other advice? Because that video spoke to me, because I see so many experts out there saying, oh, just do this and that. And they might have hustled once, but it was like a decade ago, 20 years ago. When you're in the trenches right now, it's a whole different ball game. So what's your advice for those people that are kind of busy for a good reason?
Okay, good. I'm laughing so hard because I know exactly what video you're talking about. You know, so here's the thing. As far as a creator, I mean, you're a creator, I'm a creator. What's really our job duty and responsibility? Our job duty and responsibility is really to get our message out there in every single way possible. And I love YouTube, but YouTube is just one channel, and it's obviously one of the number one search engines, so I'm not going against that. But you've got to be willing and able to get your message out there next level. I do believe you should have a podcast like you are with a different name, and you literally are creating an entirely new vertical. You can go higher level, or you can go super niche. For podcasts, you need to go higher level, like broader. But you need to do that. One, it's going to be able to get you into more places, networks, way more availability, I think a lot more listeners. But it's also going to be able to give you access, right, at a whole nother level. Let me explain one person, if you don't mind. I'm going to give you this one person's example, if you don't mind, because I think it's a really important piece. So I'm from the South. So I'm a Texas girl. I'm a Baptist girl gone bad. Okay, Benji, just so you know. And but I love Joel Osteen. He's one of my faves. If you don't know who he is, he's a Southern preacher. I love him too.
I listen to him on YouTube.
Oh, good. He's amazing. Now, here's what's interesting about Joel. His church currently in Houston is always number one or number two, usually number one, in the largest endowment of churches in the entire country. Okay, around $250 million. Now, did you know, Benji, that every single person, usually men, that come through seminary school, which means is the school to get out to be able to preach, did you know that every single one of them, they are preaching from the same book? It's called the Bible.
Yeah.
Did you know? Now, why is it that some churches at 250 million and some can't even keep their lights on? So is content really king? Is it? Because they're all preaching from the same book. So what's the difference between Joel Osteen, who's preaching from the same book, versus a small town preacher who can't even keep their lights on? What's the difference?
Delivery.
It's delivery, right? But here's the thing that Joel had. He has a background in radio. So it's distribution. So he took his 22-minute sermon 1 day a week, 52 weeks. He took that, made it evergreen. He put it on now 150 radio stations. You can easily buy that spot. Even nowadays, you can still buy that. Then he took it after 1 year. Anyone can do this. He took 52 weeks, 22 minutes of sermon, 1 day a week on Sunday. And then he bought an entire channel. Now it is a cost, $250 million on SiriusXM. And he now has a 365, 7 day a week content nonstop on one channel. Now, with audio, you can do that. You can't do that with video. That's called a distribution play. That's why he's at $250 million in endowment. That's the difference. And he understood the power of audio over video. Now, he's on YouTube, but that's not where his main distribution channel is. It's audio across the world. And I think he understood that. I'll end with this, even during the current pandemic 2020, I watched him. He's so brilliant at understanding this concept that not one time did he even say the word 2020 or COVID. He said challenging times, because he knew he could use that content for years to come. That's the power of distribution of audio.
Wow. Mind blown. I mean, I've never heard that story. I know Joel Osteen and the power, and I didn't even think about this. Joel Osteen, I never see him recording content like in a separate studio. It's always just him on stage reading from the Bible, probably his notes, right? And that is kind of interesting to consider, that he is scaling to the moon. He's taking
with
the one
audio.
Yeah, with audio. I don't know if he does it multiple times. I imagine that he has multiple, events, but maybe one sermon, and he's just making the most out of it. So I guess, it might not apply to everybody. Obviously, if you're creating movies or it's like a visual required recipe, I do a lot of food videos, maybe it doesn't make sense. But there's a lot of types of content that can be scaled up. So understanding this and starting to communicate in a way where your words and your sentences and your message makes sense without the visual, so that you can take the content you're already making and make micro clips of social media, but also putting it onto podcasts. I want to stress one thing. I do believe, and Heather, I would love your thoughts before we get into the last question, is I don't think it has to be perfect either. See like Gary Vaynerchuk, for example, he does a lot of video-centric conversations, a lot of like Zoom calls. He's on stage. He'll still put the audio onto podcast, his own podcast. It goes out on like anything he does, he makes it into his own podcast. So sometimes there might not be a visual there because he's referencing something, but 90% at least is audio only. Like, you don't need to see him and his reaction, whatever.
Right.
If you can get to that point, you can do what Heather's mentioning, which is take something you did once a week and make it into content, not just for other social media, but literally across multiple audio platforms. And I think this has been proven by Clubhouse. If you're not familiar, number one, you're on Clubhouse wondering why I'm talking about Clubhouse. Well, it's because I'm also on YouTube right now. But Clubhouse has taken the world by storm, literally the whole world, for I'd say 6 months of what is this thing? And it's because people just want the connection. And the words are so powerful by themselves. Of course, video has really dominated in social media and it's taken over every platform. But basically what we're saying is, outside of podcast being important, don't underestimate the power of your voice and what Heather said, your unique message. All right, Heather, we already went way beyond what I thought, but it was so good I had to keep it going. We're going to quickly get into Q&A. So I just, maybe rattle off one or two quick mistakes, and then your last message for people considering starting a podcast with their YouTube content, or a podcasters wanting to get onto YouTube. What's your last advice?
Okay, great. So my last advice in the world of mistakes of podcasters, it's not about you. We want that to make it about you, but it's not about you. It's about serving, right? It's about serving the potential client or the audience. That's number one. And your job, duty, responsibility is to be what I call infotainment, right? That's the key piece that people don't understand. It's infotainment. And then your job and duty responsibility is to really be able to draw people in and to move them into what I call some kind of action. That could be a like, that could be a follow, that could be an opt-in, it could be buy a course. But that's really your job, duty, responsibility. Not just to give content, because everyone can do that, but how do you be infotainment inside the conversation? That's what a true entrepreneur is. The entrepreneur's job, duty, responsibility is to be able to provide content and move people from one place to another so they add value, basically add value to the marketplace. So that's my biggest. If I could just hone that into everyone, then every podcast would be freaking amazing, is that you're paid for your value in the marketplace. Now, the marketplace will change what they value, right? So it's our job, doing responsibility of entrepreneurs, to listen to what's the value, how can we add to that, and then how can we help the marketplace. That's the number one. And then the number two is collaborate. It's not about you. It is a collaboration. Be a football fan. Be on the court. Be in a football. I'm all about football. So, don't be the center stage. Be a great quarterback.
There you go. Well,
and then
Go Ravens.
That's the biggest mistake.
Heather, well, thank you so much. By the way, if you're watching the replay of this, this is where it ends. We do the Q&A exclusive for people who are members of the Video Influencers Members Only Club. So join if you want to see that. Get ready to ask your questions. If you're on Clubhouse, we're ready to ask the questions of Heather. But I lastly want to...
Can I share my class one more time, Benji, if you're okay with that?
Let me share it for you, okay?
Okay.
So if you guys want to master podcasting and are about to launch, Heather's got this program right now in a few days, how to increase your visibility, exposure, and authority the smart way. Launch influencer podcast. What are your last things that you want to say, Heather, before we get into Q&A?
Awesome. I think that everyone in the world who is an entrepreneur or a wannabe entrepreneur should have their own podcast, their own show, their own platform to increase their visibility and credibility in the world. Honestly, it is really your job, doing your responsibility to add that value to the marketplace and to give people an opportunity to say yes to you and to work with you. I think that's your God-given right. And I'm just super excited to be here. But more importantly, you are the voice, right? You are the voice. You are the message, and it is really your time to get your voice out there in the world and your message. So I hope I can support you in that. Make sure you DM me the word podcast on Instagram under Heather Havenwood, DM me the word podcast, or go to the link below. Thank you.
There you go. Hey, you guys, if you're watching the replay, thank you so much. Hit that like button, subscribe for more interviews like this with people crushing it on YouTube and on podcasts like this. So with that being said, we'll talk to you guys later.